I had a few of you tell me that you didn't think you were an angry person until I was done talking, and then you were a really angry person. And it wasn't just anger at me, it was a realization that there's been a lot of anger bottled up for a lot of years. Why is it that people with complex trauma have greater anger issues than people who don't? It might be interesting for you to know that psychology has now come up with new pigeonholes for complex trauma people and their anger. So they're now anger disorders. You might have been diagnosed with one, I don't know, but let me give you the main anger disorders, and what they're really referring to is a person who has trouble controlling their anger when they get angry, and they experience anger that's outside of the normal emotional scope of anger. So the first one is called IED, intermittent explosive anger. And so it's called now a disorder for somebody that frequently loses their cool and explodes. So they gave it a fancy name. And in last week we just said that is explosion anger when the volcano erupts. Second one that is now called a passive anger disorder. And that's the person who doesn't look angry, but don't get too close to them because they'll hurt you somehow. They can be porcupine-like. They can be great at delivering shots that are blended with humor, but they hurt big time. That's your passive anger disorder. And then they have the self-inflicted anger disorder, and that is the self-harm. Anger turned on yourself. Anger that comes out of guilt and shame. I don't like myself. I want to punish myself. I need to punish myself for who I am. And then ODD, or oppositional defiance disorder, is the little child that whatever you say, do this, they do the opposite. So they are just defiant of rules. They think that happiness comes from breaking rules. They think rules and authority are dumb ideas, and they just are rebellious towards everything. So some of you got all four of those, and you need a lot of help. But that is now what the psychological world is recognizing, is there's this group of people that have some big anger issues. How do we begin to define that and stick them into boxes that we can manage? Now, what I want you to understand up front is I think at some point somebody's going to try to design a pill that'll fix anger disorders. And what I want you to hear is that the anger comes from a source. And that anger disorders come out of a complex trauma world. And that's what we tried to look at last week, is when a child is living in an environment where they're not treated with love, so they're lied to, they're disrespected, life is not fair. By design, they should get angry at that, because you should have loving relationships. So anger was designed as an alarm system that said something's wrong here. If we continue to lie to each other and disrespect each other, we're going to destroy stuff. So anger was an alarm, and then anger gave the motivation to make it loving again. I don't want this to continue. It has to stop. Let's get back to loving. So that was the design of anger. But in a complex trauma home, there's lots of violations of love. You're lied to. It's not fair. You're disrespected. And the child gets angry, and then they get punished for being angry. So their only option is to stuff it down. Because to get angry is only to result in more pain. It won't enable anything to be resolved. It'll only result in getting punished. So a complex trauma child who is experiencing healthy anger but can't resolve anything and can't express it, stuffs it down and creates a volcano with lava. And that lava bubbles away, and when they hit adult life, whenever they're disrespected, lied to, cheated, and life's not fair, they explode. And the eruption of that volcano takes place. So anger disorders come out of a complex trauma world. Second thing that I want you to understand, and I referred to it last week, is there's such a thing as an anger hangover. Now, I thought I had developed that term about 10 years ago when I taught anger in greater depth. So I went on Google this week and I put in anger hangover, and there's all kinds of people that talk about anger hangovers. And if you've had severe anger, what you know happens with that is a huge adrenaline rush. That is the brain kicking in to release cortisol, which releases adrenaline, which gives you energy to fight harder. And it gives you energy to carry out your motivation to correct things. But adrenaline leaves you with a hangover. Afterwards, you're just, whoa, you're wiped. It's like you wake up from being drunk for a couple of days. Your brain's fuzzy. You can't think clearly. You don't have energy. You feel a bit blurry in your thinking, and you're not motivated. And that can happen for people who live with anger and erupt on a regular basis is they begin having anger hangovers. Third thing, it is super important to understand anger within the brain. So we spend a lot of time teaching the science of the brain, and we make a big distinction between the limbic brain and the cerebral cortex. The limbic brain is what is triggered in complex trauma. It is the survival center of the brain, but it's also the emotion center of the brain. That's why fear triggers that limbic system. Anger triggers that limbic system. But it's also the first part of the brain to develop in a child. So we call it the child brain. And the concern of the limbic brain is if I'm feeling an unpleasant emotion like anger or fear, I want it fixed now. Immediate gratification, immediate relief. And so what happens when a person is in normal life in a healthy home, their limbic brain reports to their cerebral cortex, and the cerebral cortex is kind of the healthy daddy of the family. And the limbic brain are the children saying, I'm feeling this, I'm feeling this, I'm feeling this. And the cortex design is to take each of those signals, those messages, and to evaluate it and come up with a wise way to respond to that. So the design is that the thinking, the cortex, the wise part of the brain trumps the limbic part of the brain, and the limbic just serves the cortex by feeding it information. When a child has complex trauma, the cortex doesn't develop because they get stuck in the limbic brain. And then as they get older, the limbic brain trumps the cortex. And so now you make decisions based on how you're feeling, not based on what is wise. And you make decisions based on instant gratification. So what I want you to understand is this. There are two emotions that impact the limbic brain with greater intensity than any other emotions, and they are anger and fear. And it is anger and fear that cause the release of cortisol in the brain, which amps up the intensity that the limbic feels. So there are two emotions in recovery that can get you to go from living in your cortex and doing a lot of really wise behaviors to going back to living out of your limbic brain and doing a whole bunch of dumb things you later regret. So what I tell clients all the time is this. I'm not really concerned about 95% of your life where you're living out of your cortex and you're making good decisions. That's not going to trip you up. What is going to trip you up is when anger and fear hit and they trigger your limbic with such intensity, they trump your cortex. That's when you're going to make the impulsive decisions that you can't take back and that you're later going to regret. So that becomes the challenge in recovery, is you have to learn how to manage those two very powerful, intense emotions that really give a lot of pressure to have your limbic trump your cerebral cortex. A huge, huge challenge. Number 4, an even bigger challenge. I have taught for the last while, we did a whole night on it here, that when a person comes out of complex trauma and addiction, I say they have 5 people inside of them. Now, they're not 5 multiple personalities. It's 5 different circuits in your brain that can be triggered. So you're designed in recovery is to live out of your adult brain, your cerebral cortex. That's when you do wise things and make good decisions that have good long-term consequences. That's not the problem. In recovery, your adult part of you, the adult part of your brain, is usually the weakest part because it's in early development. Then you have what I call the addict part of you. And what I mean by that is if you were to relapse today, it would be like a brand new person came out of you. That adult that was wise and considerate and honest and responsible, gone on a vacation. Because now what's coming out is self-centered, they are demanding, irresponsible, narcissistic, and angry. A total different personality just came out. But what I want you to keep track of is this. Anger is part of that addict part of you. And when that addict part of you kicks in, you become a narcissist because now it's all about you. You want your drug, you want everything on your terms. Second person, if your mental health gets triggered. So if your anxiety gets triggered or if your depression gets triggered, it's like a different person comes out. The adult you wants to be involved with relationships and people. When depression and anxiety hits, I don't want people. I don't want responsibilities. I want to sleep all day. I want to isolate. You realize that when mental health gets triggered, there's usually anger. Depression has an anger part. Anxiety has an anger part. And when mental health is triggered, you usually become a narcissist. I want everything to be about me now because I'm in pain. And then the third one is when your trauma gets triggered. So if you're riding home and you see somebody from your past on the street and it triggers a trauma from the past, a different you comes out. You go into fight, flight. And part of fight, flight is anger and narcissism. And then there's a little child in you that was not allowed to grow up because you didn't like that child and you stuck them in a closet and you never wanted to deal with them. But if that child gets triggered now, you become a different person. And you become this person that suppresses anger. So do you see what I'm getting at? If you look at the 4 most powerful people inside of your brain, the 4 most powerful circuits, any of those circuits all has an anger component, and all of those circuits have a narcissist component. And narcissism and anger go together. So what you're doing in recovery is having this new adult you. Your goal is to grow and become stronger in that adult part of your brain, but you're fighting against forces that once triggered are super powerful, and that is the battle. And so you are fighting against 4 powerful forces that all have anger as part of their personality. And so part of recovery is strengthening the adult and learning how to resist and manage the pull of those 4 other forces when they're triggered.